Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. You guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And for those of you who don't like these sort of videos, you saw the title of the video and you clicked on it. And if you guys do like these sort of videos, remember to click like down below because I still got those same 3 guys running that dislike bot. But a number of people have awared me that Jeff Nipples did a video with Menno Henselmans discussing advanced full body workouts. Of course, the more amusing part for me was him shopping for a pre-workout meal.
Hey guys, it's Jeff Nipples here. I'm in this little place in Australia trying to find a pre-workout meal, and I found this high-sugar soy bar, and it's got soy protein in it because the soy is going to help with my high voice.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and put on my +5 hat of Speechcraft. And let's talk about this. That's kind of one of the interesting things that I saw there. Again, I don't know what's up with all these Canadian dudes and their soy and all this other stuff they have going on. But it seems to be rampant in the whole circle of guys that he runs with. There's just, I don't know, like a phytoestrogen overload or something. I think that affects their brains in certain ways. But, again, all this soy, and I'm surprised he didn't eat some soy with Vegan Gains when they were hanging out together. Sorry, not Vegan Gains. With Strap-On Destiny when they were hanging out together, but to each their own. What I thought was interesting, Menno is one of those guys that I really like a lot of what he does and I really dislike a lot of what he does. So, I mean, that's kind of one of those people that he's a mixed bag. I mean, that's an interesting thing. I think he does a lot of silly, goofy stuff. I think he gets hung up in certain ideas that I think are ludicrous because he's trying to basically biohack, and that's more or less the way I see a lot of the evidence-based guys these days, and there's a reason a lot of them are so small. There is quite frequently a lack of work ethic. A lot of them are just straight up afraid and terrified of getting under a heavy barbell, and so they try to find all these biohacks to get around working hard and putting in any sort of real work and actually getting strong while still gaining muscle. And the irony you get with someone like Menno is that Menno is one of these guys who has realized that mechanical tension might quite possibly be a bigger factor than volume. He's one of these guys who understands that there might be a discrepancy between the ratios of myofibular versus sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and there's a reason he even does down as low as 4 rep sets. He'll do 4 rep sets on multi-joint exercises for hypertrophy. All right? And that's what we need to remember. He understands that. He grasps things like concurrent periodization. He's an interesting guy in regards to that because, again, he's one of these guys that wants to look at the evidence. The downside is when he gets into really silly shit like thinking that you can replace certain big exercises with some of the worst fluff exercises that don't work because of things like the angle of the pull or blood flow restriction. And that's really kind of what bothered me when we got into the video. And I might need to do this as 2 parts because I've actually literally only watched the first half and I decided to sit down and cover it. And I might turn this into a 2-parter because the video was quite long. It's over a 20-minute video. And they got together, and at first they started off with a Romanian deadlift. Now, I don't think a Romanian deadlift is terrible, but we get into this whole point of if you're going to do full body 5 days a week, you're probably going to use a fair amount of exercise variation. Unless you're doing a Bulgarian style training, you're probably going to do a lot of exercise variation. I very much question, though, how well this is going to work. I very much question it. I don't believe the evidence goes that way, and that's something that I've changed stances on over the years. And I've had to look at it from the weight of the evidence, the way that the best lifters and champions in the world do things. And as much as I might like the philosophy behind it, I just don't see champions being produced with ultra-high frequency full body training. And it doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at the full data. And I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying it has problems. And so, again, people have seen me push away from that. And I've generally gone back over and said, you know what? Unless you have a very specific reason, deviating from a 3-day-a-week full body or like an upper-lower 4-day-a-week periodized type program. I really don't see the need to do anything besides those two. And I'm not even being dogmatic. This is me kind of coming around, having looked at all this stuff for decades and what works, what doesn't work. And those two systems, depending upon your experience level, just seem to produce the best results. And champions over the decades, they produce the best athletes. And there's a certain amount of data that would suggest that you can plug everything you need into those templates quite easily, based upon, again, things like muscle protein synthesis uptime, training volume, recovery windows, avoiding overuse injuries. And that's my real concern with the ultra high frequency full body, is the tendency for connective tissue and stuff to not recover correctly. And again, just my observation over the years. I've done it. I've used it. And that's kind of the way I lean with all of it. And I've just kind of gone over and said, I just don't see the need to deviate from these other two systems unless you have a legitimately good reason. There could be individual personal reasons, but as a cookie cutter system, I don't think we need to deviate from either. And they work, they're effective, they produce the best in the world in multiple sports. We shouldn't need to deviate from that, particularly when the sum of the data would suggest also on top of it that they're actually, you can train optimally with those systems. In other words, you can actually program everything optimally easy in those systems. And it's not always as easy to do it when you deviate. So again, we're getting down to people's possible advantages maybe being psychological, the way they just want to train. But they got into this and he started with Romanian deadlifts, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And they kind of did more or less started with went something like 10-8-4 or was it 8-6-4? I think it was 8-6-4, which that would be consistent with what Menno says. Menno's realized that mechanical tension is an enormous factor in muscle hypertrophy. And that's something he's been arguing with in the other circle, the circle that Jeff frequents, the same circle of scholars that Jeff frequents with and does, again, collaboration work with, speaks at events with and everything, have tried to push in the other direction, saying volume is the primary driver. And it's because they're all under Dr. Tad Broenfeld, and they all work together on this stuff. But again, I don't have a problem with the Romanian deadlift and what they talked about with the different aspects of it. I thought Menno brought up some good points as far as the tension of it, of what you feel versus what's isometric versus dynamic in the way it affects where you think you feel the muscle. And I think a lot of that was interesting, and that's worth delving into, and he's right to some extent. But that's also why I tell people things like worrying a whole lot about where you feel an exercise may not be valid, because in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. There are other external factors that could impact why you feel something in a certain area more than another, and it's not necessarily because of muscle fiber recruitment. Right? There's a lot of other stuff going on, and it's not always an accurate gauge. It can be in some cases. It's not always an accurate gauge of what's being worked. And then what bothered me, though, they jumped from that over to the blood flow restriction. And that's one of those things that I am always been skeptical of. And I'm surprised that Menno always pushes it, because even Menno has been realizing that we may be dealing with different things in anabolic signaling, particularly with the really high volume metabolic work, that it may not produce what we think it's going to produce in terms of muscle growth. That a lot of this could be fleeting, a lot of it's short term, and it may not actually lead to lasting tissue hypertrophy. And I've seen a lot of stuff that Lyle McDonald's put out, that he's put out, and they've been discussing that. And that would tend to agree with my anecdotal observations over the decades among lifters. Right, it would agree with it very heavily, but he's trying to push the blood flow restriction stuff there, and that's one of those that you're just not going to get me on board with. I've seen all the data they produced, and we're dealing with the fact that I've never seen convincing data that would tell me that, number one, is even safe. Number two, that it actually produces lasting hypertrophy other than just some metabolites, because again, the same thing we get from the higher rep stuff, I'm not convinced that actually produces lasting muscle growth. Are we talking about an acute stimulus, an acute metabolite and hormonal response? Yes. Is that the difference between showing a long-term, say over the course of a year, actual lasting changes in myofibrillar hypertrophy, or, again, thickening up the actual muscle fibers that we can measure? There's a difference between that. It's speculated. There's a correlation between those metabolites and muscle growth. Doesn't mean that it's going to cause it, though. So I always think it's interesting that he still does this sort of stuff, and I don't think the evidence is particularly strong for it. But we come over to the other point, is that he mentioned again working it in as in addition to your heavy work, and that's where we get into the stuff. He talked about, there is certainly something to concurrent style periodization, to where you have phases or the mixed training in that they feed into each other. And that I will agree with, because that's even the way that I train. But I think that what people need to remember is that when you look at something like concurrent periodization, you need to look at it in broader terms. I felt like he kind of jumped in and really was too specific, in the sense of saying, yeah, you could mix your really heavy weight with really high reps and alternate them like into different days, and it works quite well from a periodization perspective. And there's some evidence that it improves muscle growth, it improves strength better, everything else. Well, that I will agree with. And he's right, and there's a reason I train that way. And people will say, oh, Jason, you're only saying that because you train that way. Well, let me come back around and let's use some common sense when people say that. Do you think I believe in it because I train that way, or I chose to train that way because I believe in it? See the difference there? I utilize those methods because I know they work. I don't think that they work because I chose to utilize them. People get it backwards. It's the other. It's the weight of the evidence tells me they work, so therefore I said, I should probably do this. So again, that's practicing what you preach. That's looking at evidence, looking at data, looking at large amounts of anecdote and some scientific evidence, and saying this seems to work. I should probably do that, and basically practicing what you preach. That's what that comes down to. And it does work. I'm actually getting pretty good results these days training with concurrent and a conjugate style method. But I think what we need to remember there is that when we're dealing with this, it's not necessarily rep range you're talking about. In other words, concurrent periodization means that we rotate through performance elements. In my case, it's not high rep work with really low rep work. It's maximum work, meaning hitting actual training maxes on certain days and then doing dynamic effort work on other days. But the dynamic stuff, I'm still not doing over 5s. And then we do assistance and accessory work in different rep ranges, right? We do those movements, and those are not my primary training stimulus. My primary stimuluses are the maximum strength work and the speed strength work. But we separate those into different days, and they feed into each other. And it does have to do with the different adaptations and recoveries. In fact, when you separate performance elements, you can do them more frequently. In other words, if you trained only with heavy maxes or only with dynamic effort work in order to get a maximum stimulus and the best performance possible, you would actually have to separate them out further than we do when we put them in the same week, because you're not always fully recovered and able to replicate and progress. Whereas if you're doing each one, say, only once a week, right, you're doing each one only once a week, and you do the others more frequently, you can rotate through your elements more frequently and adapt every single time and improve. And it's because, again, there's less cross interference between the different performance elements. When one's recovering, you can train the other. So again, there's certainly something to that, and he's right on that, and I would agree with that, and I'm glad he addressed that. But the biggest thing that bothered me was, again, the pushing the blood flow restriction. Because a lot of the stuff he had to say was good. Again, talking about certain things with concurrent style training. Again, demonstrating that even very, very heavy weight has its place even for hypertrophy training into certain exercises, certain blocks, certain days. I like all of that, and I agree with that. I'm glad that he brought those points up. But I also don't like the fact that the silly blood flow restriction stuff is being used, because, again, I don't think there's compelling evidence that it works. I don't think there's evidence that it's safe. And at the end of the day, he's saying, oh, we do this just to, work our quads and be safer on our knees. Why don't you just pick exercises that are safer on your knees, right? There are plenty of exercises that cause very little knee shear that are much better, much superior hypertrophy exercises to wrapping some rubber bands around your quads and doing leg extensions. Again, we know all this stuff. This has been studied in the strength world. Maybe the bodybuilding world should spend some time catching up with the strength world. You guys are about 30 years behind still. I'm just throwing it out there. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.